But what we want to do now is just sort of do like a quick wrap up and to talk maybe at a higher level than at the project level, and maybe talk a bit about next steps, because one of the things that I found amazing about these events is firstly, you got the province of Ontario to release new data sets right there, right? That's amazing. Big accomplishment. Second thing is, what data do we need to start chasing after this event? So I'm sticking my hand up here. I will help with that. I know how to do that, so let me know. Another thing too is, what stories maybe can we continue to try to get out there and think about, in terms of, and how to do that. And I think the final thing to think about as a next step as we talk about this is, Judy was here. I'm just going to start with the Judy story, then we'll pass it around. Judy was here on Friday, and she was talking about, and it's kind of what the final group's presentation was, like the data relating to police and using a translation service and then not having follow-up as to what happened, and were police talking to people without interpreters. And I was sitting there thinking, in all the times of you hear about activism around police and domestic violence, nothing about this kind of data has ever come up. And it's not a thing I do a lot of, but I do enough of it that at this point I realize there's an opportunity to do there's an advocacy opportunity for people who are already looking after this stuff to start asking for different kinds of data from the police. Like this is a new track to go down. So I think as we talk, I'm going to be taking notes too and think about, like, are there more of those things that surfaced? Because not just asking for data, but actually trying to build cross-coalition advocacy using data. So that's the kind of stuff. So yeah, that's all I want to say before we get to talk. I want to say so we are all very, very lucky that September Anderson, friend, neighbor, colleague, collaborator and things, is here. I kind of want September, yeah, she's eating, so it's perfect, but I kind of want September to tell her story, because she is a unicorn. She really is a unicorn, for many reasons, but particular to today's context, September was working in journalism. She's now a web developer. She sits at the intersection of those two things, I think, in her brain still, regardless of the journalism. And I think September is critical in a way that I don't think is common enough in a lot of the way that stuff gets interrogated in, like in general media. And I think that's interesting. And I kind of want her to introduce herself a bit in terms of maybe telling. There's one story. I'm going to let you pick what you want to talk about, but I can say one thing is that September knows about how certain stories just don't get press. We have a Canadian myth, right? We have an experience that we like to talk about Canada. So this story about health, people's health going down when they move to Canada, like that is a completely good example of the myth kind of thing. So September, maybe you want to just talk a little bit about yourself, and then we're going to go around here and just talk about stuff. And then we are not going to stay here all day, but just a few key points, and then move it along. So yeah. And thank you for being here. I'm really happy you could come. Thank you so much.
Well, I was laying down in my bed with one eye open, and I get this text message. So yeah, my name is September Anderson. I was a journalist for 7 years. My journalism story is interesting as well, because what I wanted to be was a fashion journalist, writing about makeup and lipstick and lifestyle, and I guess my conscience would not allow me to write about beauty, and I started writing about so many things. I started with the Danzig shooting, which is one really big piece that I wrote about, and it just kept going and going, and then I started giving lectures and speaking on panels, and then I was being an expert while also being a journalist and trying to get stories told and having a really, really hard time doing that. And I guess because of my academic background, I was also finding so many studies and so many data, or finding data that was great information, but 10 years old, and looking for the follow-up, and there's no follow-up, which is so frustrating about the Canadian context, because then you'd look to the US or the UK and you'd find these numbers and they don't exist within Canada. One of my most recent data finds, just before I was like, screw it, I'm not doing journalism anymore, which was very recently. I wrote my last article in April. I found a study, and it was looking at different generations of Canadians. So first generation, second generation, who I would be, my mom and my dad are born in Trinidad and Jamaica. And they were talking about the increased dissatisfaction and lack of connection with being seen as Canadian, and the factors that influence that, which I found especially important considering what was going on with Brexit, and we've got what was going on with Trump, and we have this increase in surge of white supremacy within this country. I mean, the white people matter too signs or whatever that all over York, and some of them have razor blades behind them so that people who are tearing them, you know what I mean? But anyways, so I found this data, and it was so interesting, but I wanted to compare it to previous data, and there wasn't any previous data, and it was so frustrating. And you know what I mean? Me and CBC were working together trying to get this story told, but being like, there's not enough information. So that was it's hard enough to tell stories about racialized people who are racialized people in general, but then you're looking at racialized people who are becoming increasingly dissatisfied and disenfranchised when we have this Western influx. And we've got these refugee issues and all of these other things that are going on, stories that need to be told, but to convince an editor to let the story be told, they want the data.
And is the data there? So I think that's a perfect question to, you know, as a jump off. Were people surprised at what they couldn't find? Was that a theme that was sort of consistent? Yeah, Gregory, you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, we're actually looking for data on immigrant men who were the victims of domestic abuse. And we couldn't find anything on it. And that was, in a way, not surprising, because just from a gender, looking at it from the gender side, it would be underreported by men, right? Just because of the way we're made up, or culturally, in all different cultures, just the way we are. But there really wasn't anything we could find on domestic abuse from immigrants as far as men being the victims, or not a whole lot on anybody being the victims. And I think part of it is, I think, the realization of men being able to be the victim of domestic abuse is just a recent thing as far as it coming up to the surface. So that's part of it. So maybe in the next 4 years, we'll see a lot more of it, but there should be more data on that men being the victims of domestic abuse as immigrants, and also in the general population.
And if you could, just because I know you told me, what did you ask me about?
The other data set I was interested in and couldn't find anything on was disabilities and immigrants. And just that, I couldn't find a whole lot. You told me that there might be a couple of places, but it's really amazing how few or how little that information is out there, and how it's buried someplace. And you'd have to get maybe a friend of a friend that knows something somewhere. But I think, personally, I think that is important to me, getting that information about disabilities, whether it's immigration related or just the general public, just getting that out there.
Right. Anybody else have experiences or thoughts on what you weren't finding? Does this experience, I mean, at a high level, there was stuff you're looking for you weren't finding?
This is in my previous career, but this was only about a year ago when I was looking for information about Black women in mental health. Right? Black women in Canada and mental health. The only thing that kept coming up was Black teen pregnancy. That was, and it's, even with that, with Bell Let's Talk, it's always an interest. Where's this information? Because like this term intersectionality, you know, it's thrown around a lot, but at its root, intersectionality is about women who happen to be Black. And so finding women who are Black and mental health was impossible. And it's frustrating because disabilities and immigrants is very important, and it impacts people's quality of life, and it feeds into so many of these other things. That should be information that is not hard to find. We're not looking for immigrants with 6 toes who like red nail polish. That's not what we're looking for. To look for something that improves the quality of people's life and their satisfaction within this country should not be difficult, and I should not know a PhD student or professor who wrote this obscure thesis on this topic who has access to JSTOR.
Yeah. Any other comments on this topic? Because go.
I just want to say, sorry. No, I just want to say it's interesting, September, what you are saying, because this particular thing is something that is collected. I mean, if you go to the doctor's office, they ask us all kinds of questions. So it just is not out there for whatever reason. It's not that it's not there, it's not available.
So I think the theme that I would keep here, and I'm going to find my notebook, is sort of back to the way September started this, is if you need the data to tell the hard story in the first place, and we're missing the data, we have like a foundational problem. Yeah?
Do you think the data is maybe not available because of the Privacy Health Information Act?
There's a lot of reasons the data isn't available. Some of the data is available, it's just old. Mm-hmm. And realistically, you know what I mean? I can make it work kind of with something that's 10 years old, but you shouldn't be working with data. Yeah. There's so many gaps, and it's a lot of things. There's, you know what I mean? There's the fact that we just got our census back, and that's going to completely screw us because we won't be able to compare data for a long time. We're screwed for a number of, at least 5 years, and then we'd only have 2 sets of numbers to be able to compare. It's the census is the issue. It's funding that's the issue. It's hard to find funding to talk, you know what I mean, to do research on marginalized people. It's also, even when we look at the carding data, it was the Toronto Star spent a lot of money to get that carding data, to analyze that carding data, to make that carding data available. There are not many people who have the manpower and the money to be able to do something like that. I spoke with, I can't remember his name, but the white dude who does all of the policing stuff. And I remember I had interviewed him, and he's like, so many academics wanted to do it and couldn't do it because the Toronto Star ended up getting sued by the police. There are not many people who have a legal team. There's some people, there's just not the money. It's too hard to do. And it's hard as me as just a journalist to be like, hey, police, I want the data. Hey, government, I want the data, as opposed to the Toronto Star saying, I want the information. There's so many roadblocks. And sometimes it is there and it's language, like there's so many issues.
I noticed yesterday on one of the open data sites that we were looking at, there were 3 kind of levels of data: restricted, under review, and open. So, you know, these are surveys that are done, but they're restricted, but they're, you know, kind of teasing us saying, you know, we have the data, but we're not going to give it to you.
Exactly.
And then the other point to that was...
but to your point, there is work, even as Bianca touched on, there's work that we need to do to redefine what restricted data means. A lot of time, it's not private, it's just not being made available to us, and it should be. So a redefinition of what restricted data is and what we are allowed to have. And the more people press for that information, the more of that information will be made available. And even when we're talking about health data, we're not asking for the names and the phone numbers or blood samples of these people. We just want to know how many immigrants have disabilities. How many Black women between the ages of 18 and 35 are dealing with mental health issues? What are those mental health issues? We're not asking for personal data. And oftentimes the government, even the TDSB, I think they're the first school board, they do a census and they collect race-based data. Like even like race-based data used to be so hard to get, and now there's a press to make more people collect race-based data. The police didn't want to do it because they felt it would be racist to collect that data. So as time goes on and as people continue to press, we're being able to get more information. So we have to keep pressing so that that which is restricted is no longer restricted, while we're still maintaining people's privacy, but getting the information we need to be able to advocate for better.
And another roadblock, I guess, that we came up to yesterday was there was a subscription to one of the to access some of the data that only, I think, 6 or 8 organizations had access to, but the subscription's $5,000. So if you want access to this data, you need to pay for it, even though it's supposed to be open.
Yeah, there's one way.
Get the funding issues.
Yeah, and one thing that might be like it's an advocacy thing is some of the community organizations, you know, the social planning councils, they kind of teamed up and they build a coalition to buy the license and then use it jointly. So it's interesting too to think of maybe like some of this data, people who've used data for so long might be in those coalitions, but who's not, right? Like who are the people who might need to join in and start having access? Because some of this stuff is not going to come out, like they're stuck on licensing it. So that might be a way to get there. Got hands over there, cool. I'm going to give it to her because you haven't talked yet.
I just had a quick question to follow up. So September mentioned the fact that the power of someone like the Toronto Star has a lot of power in terms of requesting things. Is there a process or a way that we can build a process or transparency or documentation or give power to independent journalists or something like that to kind of, or is it just a money thing for the most part?
There's so many different things. And we also have to remember when you're requesting information from somebody like the police, they can give it to you or they won't give it to you. What are the repercussions? So it all depends. Like a high-profile journalist may be able to ask for it. If I ask for it, they're not going to do it. I can put in 12 million requests and even write an article about how many requests I put in, they won't answer. They still won't give it to me. So in terms of that process, maybe talk to the police board or, you know what I mean, an oversight committee who can make them do that. But, you know what I mean? They make their own rules. Well, I mean, it's not really hard to make the request.
No, but like...
Oh, okay.
Giving power to anyone.
Yes.
So when only if you're successfully get that information, that means as a function of that,
Yep.
the reporting that's going to be done is going to be very little.
Yes, and that's the other challenge is in J school they tell you if you see information, like just because the Globe and Mail said it doesn't mean that it's true. But what we're working on with that police data is that the Toronto Star said it, and so we have to assume that their methodology and everything is true, which is also not the best way to be going about reporting on information when we haven't seen, you know what I mean? I haven't seen the actual data.
There's a lack of competition because of that.
Yeah. Well, it's also funny, you'd think, like, is the Sun going to request that data and analyze it and put it in that way, right? The Globe, are they going to do it? They're going to report on that story? So we end up getting screwed with the lack of options that we have, who gets to tell the story. The Toronto Star is our progressive newspaper. That's, you know what I mean? Even when you think on the alternative level, there's Just Now. I doesn't exist anymore. And so there's so many ways. That's why journalism is so important. In a democratic society, they are who, you know what I mean, find the information for the people and keep them informed. And if there are so few, you know what I mean, gigs in town, that really screws the rest of us over. Oh, you're good.
So, seeing among some experts, I just wanted to spread a wishful thought. Maybe there's a possibility for that, and that's that when we were doing our research with domestic violence, we kept wishing we had access to Children's Aid Society's database to see how many of those cases the perpetrator is female and how many of those cases the perpetrator is male, to see how and what is actually considered as child abuse, what is considered as abuse, just so and when they link it to domestic violence, how what is the procedure for us to use that towards the data that we were trying to build. So we kept wishing that they would at least disclose that data to another social entity, being MCIS. So if they don't want to put it out as an open data for everyone to have access, but maybe they can give bits and bits of it to social entities that pertain to their services. For example, we can take the language share, someone else can get a different share, and then a reporter can go to all of those different social enterprises and gather what they need.
Yeah, and this, I'm just going to give it to you, but in response to that, I want to bring up, there's a thing in Canada called the First Nations Information Governance Center, and it is it's an Indigenous community who are saying, I own our community's data. I'm not making it open, and if you want to use it, you're going to come tell me how you're going to use it, because we've been marginalized so frequently by putting data out there that it's now its own weapon against, like, you know, if someone else gets to pick the stories, we got a problem. And I thought that was, like, that's interesting to put it in the hands of someone where there's, like, trusteeship in a way, to know that the way it's going. Because it's really interesting, because they're challenging the definition of open data. Because there's this global assumption, open it, open it, open it. It's like, no, hold on. So there's precedent for, like, kind of taking it back, and I think it's very valid.
You would only take care of things that you're an expert on. For example,
Exactly.
because we know language and how to protect vulnerable sector from language barriers, then we'll handle that. Someone else can handle housing and shelter, and you know.
We have a comment from the audience, from the live audience. They're saying they cannot hear everything we say, so we really have to keep our mic here, because the quality of these mics is apparently worse than that one, but we don't want to go there. So that's all. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I sort of had a separate point, but to your point about access to information, understanding the nuances of the privacy legislation that governs these kinds of things is important, because a lot of the issue has to do with being able to attribute certain personal characteristics to individuals. So if you can depersonalize that information, it reduces what you can use it for, but it is more information in absolute terms, right? So you can get, they won't necessarily be able to tell you the age of the party who reported this, but you can make certain inferences based on the absolute numbers if you ask for the data in a specific format, in a specific way. Because sometimes they'll say, no, we can't give you that information, it's a violation of privacy. But if you specify that we're just looking for like the depersonalized absolute numbers, then like they might be able to give that to you. What I was going to say though is that some of the conversations that I've had based on my experience as a lawyer is that there are ways of making social justice, or certain ways of making social justice profitable. And so, for instance, I worked in class actions, and so we did human rights cases. We did a lot of cases where we were representing marginalized people as a class so that they could get some compensation that they wouldn't have access to on an individual basis. Some of those cases, though, do pertain to public records, or we require public records in order to advance the litigation. And because we are anticipating a fairly sizable payout at the end of it, we will invest in that kind of information in making the information requests that people wouldn't necessarily be able to afford on an individual basis. And because they are a matter of public record, a lot of the time there is no restriction on how those records can be used. It's just a matter of having to pay for them. But then that information just stays there, right? It's not like the law firm at that point will go and just put it in some sort of public source arena. So I think this kind of interdisciplinary conversation is great for the purposes of conversation, but it should also serve as an opportunity to make connections and expand that field so that we are, for instance, talking to different law firms, especially the huge Bay Street law firms, and say, hey, do you have any data on this? Like, look for cases, look for case law, look for the law firm that advanced that case, ask whether they got any data, ask whether they just call and ask, like, hey, can I speak to someone who does your access to information requests, and ask whether they have any ongoing, have a short conversation about whether or not there's anything that they have that you can use, that kind of thing, and make that an ongoing relationship.
Can I jump in and make a point here? I actually have a question and a comment. One is, we have a ton of experience with freedom of information requests, and it's a sham, because most of the information that you get is redacted, and that is useful, is redacted on some obscure ground or the other, and you can appeal it to, you know, the cows come home, and it still will stay somewhere in limbo. So we've had requests that are now pending for 2 years, and we've had no information. And going back to the other point that Bianca was making with respect to what Judy said, so that's one thing that needs to be addressed, right? The whole freedom of information piece. But I have a question, for example, and maybe September can help us. So with the police, what we are faced with, and there is a freedom of information request that we've made, is that police officers will double up as interpreters, just exactly what Nazneen was saying. So they speak a little bit of Farsi, now they are expert interpreters, and so one officer will call another. And there is a huge financial impact to this. And the reason for that is because this officer that's called in can now put in overtime. Every time he shows up in court, he or she gets time and a half. And I know that this is being live streamed, but that's okay. And so they attended the scene, 2 officers now interrogating this perpetrator rather than 1. So that on its face is unfair. But the other thing that happens is, the bottom line, they have $1 billion payroll budget, and all of this comes under salaries. So it doesn't affect their budget line. So if they now have to pay for interpreters, it has to come out of another pot. So they say they don't have money for it because it gets hidden under another line. So what we said is, we want to find out from you all the circumstances under which an interpreter has gone, a police officer has doubled up as an interpreter. That's all the information we want. We want to know all those cases, and they will not give us that information. So we put in a freedom of information request, but they'll probably tell us they can't.
But that, she would best, well, with her legal background, best be able to say that. But that sounds like a humongous human rights violation and something that should be handled by a larger court. Because that shouldn't be, especially when you're talking about interpreters and not being biased, a police appointed or a police interpreter shouldn't be doing that type of work. So it sounds like a larger issue and something that somebody with oversight should be dictating that this is not allowed to happen under any circumstances because it's a violation of this person's human rights.
So a story needs to be told about that.
There does. What is his name? Jim Rankin. That's his name. And he's very good. Like, I've sent him emails and be like, yo, this is a story you need to tell. But no, a journalist needs to tell that story and highlight that so that the public knows that this is something that's happening, because it sounds like a human rights violation and completely, yeah, exactly.
Yeah, all I was going to say is you're completely right about, obviously, Freedom of Information Act requests, but to your point about sort of the relationship between power and getting Freedom of Information Act requests, that's why I think, I mentioned that, you know, law firms can afford to pay for a lot of the times these exorbitant fees for the information, but this thing that I didn't mention is, you know, because law firms have influence, because they do this for a living, because they have an interest in getting that information, so they might doggedly go after it and you know, make a scene if it doesn't come through correctly. Those are other reasons why partnering with organizations that have those kinds of interests is important. And there are times that they're not going to be able to share, but they won't necessarily say no if they don't have any interest in not sharing.
And the information that they had would be closer to complete than what she would get or I would get.
Right. So they might say, sorry. Right. So they might say, for instance, like you said, stuff will be redacted, but sometimes if you have somebody who does Freedom of Information Acts for a living, they'll find ways of making the request. They know the language to use to get the person, because these are just people getting you the data, and a lot of the times they're not trying to be a jerk. They're not like trying to cover anything up. You know, they're not part of a big conspiracy. They're just doing their job, and sometimes people get lazy, or sometimes people don't want to think creatively about how to do it. But sometimes these people will have relationships and experience that enables them to frame what they're looking for in a way that will get them more information than they would be able to get just if I was like, hey, can I get this? And then after 3 months, they're like, nope, you can't. And then you need to take another shot at being like, well, then can I get this? And they're like, no. Yeah. That's another reason to try to build those relationships.
And I want to go around now to people who haven't said anything yet, just to give you some space. Not that you have to, but do you have anything that you want to?
Just in terms of FOI requests, I don't know how specialized it can get, because like in our courses right now in J School, for research methods, we're learning about, you know, how important it is to put just specific time frames, make sure you don't have any personal information, give them the exact, like, look at the kind of, you can also initially ask for what their headings are, so you can just tell them specific headings to just reduce the amount of work they'd have to do and make it really clear, exact. So know your research questions going in, and then instead of just asking for a full data set, in which case it would be a big headache for them to release it. Also keeping in mind that since I think requests for information have become much more popular with the police over the last several years, there's a huge backlog as well now, especially. So keeping in mind that like they just have this new influx with maybe without raising infrastructure could cause some delays, we've been told. But yeah, it'd be good to see. Yeah.
Yeah, it's really good advice. Can you guys keep it down a little bit? We're having a hard time hearing.
Just to address that quickly, as I said, sort of just to make this on a personal practical level, you can imagine getting a request from you, right? And you say, hey, I want this heading, I want that heading, and I want this and that and that. And it seems simple, but the person who's executing it might say, well, I can't give you that information because it might, if it's combined with this information, it will give you too much information about the personal details of, you know, this case, for instance. So people who have, and I'm not one of these people who has this area of specialization, I'm just saying that these people with these areas of specializations exist. They will say, I want this information in one document. So I want the ages of everyone who reported this kind of crime. And I want the, the police department of everyone who reported this kind of crime, right? The same kind of crime, but separately, right? So you disassociate the data from one another. And so the person who's executing this might feel uncomfortable or might think that it's a violation of the law. They're not a lawyer. It's not lawyers that are fulfilling these requests. It's just a guy. But he might say, like, I'm not sure whether this breaks the law, so I'm not even going to risk it, right? So finding ways and consulting with people who know what the law is and who have experience getting around these obstacles is valuable.
And I think a lot about capacity when you're talking about all of that, because it's work, right? So, yeah. Okay, so did you have anything? You're good? You got anything? Howard, nothing? Got anything? Thinking? Thank you.
Seminars and things like that are important because a journalist is not going to know that. You know what I mean? We all don't know what we each do, and therefore it's important for a journalist to get some kind of learning from somebody in the legal field to be like, this is how you actually do it. And for a translator to be able to speak to a journalist, because it's also understanding, like a lot of people are telling me, oh, I tried to get this story published. They're not journalists, blah, 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 blah. And I'm like, no, nobody's going to respond to this request. This is not how you ask for these things to be told. And like me looking at it right off the bat, it seems that you know what I mean? It seems that your intention is pretty screwy and I don't want to get, you know what I mean? Like it's important to know how to ask the other expert how to do what you're trying to do, because so much of what we're doing intersects with somebody else's job. Yeah. Or sometimes we're wearing the hat of a lawyer when we're a journalist. You know what I mean? Like, yeah, I took a media law course, barely passed it. I'm not a, you know what I mean? I'm not a media lawyer. I just know how to try not to get myself sued. So it's important, you know what I mean, to be able for all of us to crisscross and build these coalitions with various people. Because now he knows that, yo, if I want this data, I'm going to ask this law firm, or I know this law firm just did something and they were cited in this article. I'm going to ask them if they have the data. Yeah. Or she, you know what I mean? It's important for us to work together and build these bridges because we're all doing this work and we're all doing a lot of similar work and there's so much crossover, and it's important for us to keep speaking out of our field.
Absolutely. And before, okay, so that prompted something, Howard. You go first, then Howard, you go. Yeah, back.
It's okay. Thank you. I'm just curious to know that I hear that when you guys are talking about the stories that you wanted to request for information, the question was simply, can you provide me with this information? I'm wondering if there was a case where anyone has the experience of asking that entity, what is your protocol when it comes to releasing this information? Because learning about that protocol gives you more freedom to know about how to ask, what to ask, whether or not you can ask it in this way, but maybe if you ask it in a different way, because what you said makes a lot of sense to me, but in my brain I'm trying to digest and say, okay, so how am I going to adopt what she's saying, not knowing their protocol? Maybe the best step is to ask about their protocol.
Well, the protocols are public information, right? They're legislated. So we have legislation regulations that are public. It's understanding them and trying to empathize with the people who are doing this on an everyday basis, trying to do as much of their work for them, right? And so one step is going to be, it's so easy to just say no to an information request. They're gonna want to do it. They're gonna want to say no.
Oftentimes the answer, instead of being I don't know, is no.
Right. And so not only are they not going to want to risk their job over like stretching the boundaries of what the law says, it's just easier to say no. They're going to hope that you don't come back. And so understanding that. And then the second tier being understanding the legislation. And I'm not the right person to give a tutorial on the Privacy Act, but there are lawyers who I'm sure would be more than happy to come into this sort of setting, say anyone who wants to know about Freedom of Information requests, the Freedom of Information Act, the Privacy Act, that kind of thing, you know, here's what you do, right? Because yeah, the information is out there. Those procedures are out there. They're just impenetrably difficult to understand.
Yeah. So question, for example, if we want to outreach to children in society and learn about their protocol, can we just access that publicly? Where would we go?
Sorry, what? Oh, so the children. So I assume that it falls under the Freedom of Information requests, which would be under the Freedom of Information Act. And so like that would be the act that you would want to look at to see what information can they provide. The rules aren't going to be down to, you know, the Children's Aid Society. It's going to be general rules about, and like I said, the reason that they're difficult to understand is not because there's a lot of words, it's because there's almost no words. They'll say, we can't tell you who this person is. We can't give you information about the identity of this case. And so what qualifies as identifying the person in that case? There might be a person who says the combination of the victim's age and community is a violation. Another person might not see that as giving away the identity. Someone might say 3 pieces of information, but like I said, they're going to want to say no, right? So asking for unrelated data, or maybe being willing to go back 3 times saying, I want these 3 pieces of data related to these kinds of cases, all put together. And then if they say no, then saying, fine, these 2, and then these separately. And if they say no, then fine, all 3 separately, right?
Okay. Howard, if you can be patient for a minute, we got a question come in from the live stream. So you're going to give you the microphone, Craig?
So we're having some technical difficulties, but we can read them out. We're that technology savvy. So Veronica Costella asks, do legislators have to play a role in this if privacy legislation, which is by all means meant to protect our privacy, also posing undue barriers in the sharing of data?
Just tell you one thing, if it's the Privacy Act or the Commercial Privacy Act, they're both well out of date and older than the technology world we live in now. So there are discussions about looking at them and refreshing them in terms of, so yes, the answer is yes, and I think there's process underway and there's pressures that way. So that's definitely a thing that needs to happen and is starting to happen, but we'll also need advocacy to be consistent on why and how. And I don't know if anybody else wants to speak to that. Otherwise, Howard, you had one?
Yeah, more of a question and connected to your point around collaboration and how do we actually build coalitions and stuff. So I wasn't here for the whole weekend, but for the people who were participating, I would like to ask, who is not in the room then to make this coalition happen? Who would you have loved to work with who wasn't here and could have actually given you like more access or more information or made your life a whole lot easier?
In terms of who was over the course of this weekend doing this work, who could have been here to help you?
Which professions or which, yeah.
Anybody have any experiences on that one? Any ideas? Hang on, you gotta wait for the...
Well, like you said off the bat, I wasn't here all this weekend either, but like you said, a lawyer who has an awareness and understanding of the Privacy Act and making freedom of information requests. Because as you said, there is a way to get it, and the first no, they may tell you no 5 times and you get it the 6th time because you finally worded it in a way, but how to go about doing that, and that's even a possibility. So understanding the Privacy Act, understanding the Freedom of Information Act. I don't know if there's an organizer in the room, but that's always a skill that I completely lack.
Also, maybe somebody who deals with these requests within government, right? Yeah. Why not? I mean, they have an interest too, because they are handling these all the time.
And here's a good opportunity. I'm going to say the province is organizing its first digital inclusion and digital literacy conference early next year. And this, to me, is a perfect topic to start to float there, because there's so much talk about digital literacy for labor and for working and
they
for
have a survey out. I got the survey to ask about what you'd like what that digital inclusion thing should be, who should be there, et cetera, et cetera.
So this, to me, sounds like maybe we've got a perfect moment of an event to start to say, this is a session we want to have, and this is, how is this a literacy that we get in every organization? How is it in the education system, whatever else? Because otherwise this stuff turns into sort of like building, like we're learning how to code, kind of, that's not, is not the be-all end-all of digital literacy. So does anybody else have questions? Because I have a few thoughts to sort of wrap us up, but does anybody have final thoughts, anything burning that they want to say that's unrelated to what we've been talking about? Go.
I have a very quick question. Like, once you get the data you need, after a lot of hard work, what's the guarantee the data is accurate? Like, what's the guarantee that the data you got is accurate? Like, it's not like...
I can answer that question. You guarantee? There's no guarantee. No, I think what you bring up is data quality, and I think anybody who works with data a lot will tell you 80% of the work they do is to get it in good enough shape to do something with it. And so data quality, and there's the saying garbage in, garbage out, right? And this has been an issue that came up recently somewhere I was, where we were talking about even all the government data is still being built within a certain frame, right? What's the methodology that was used? So even when so you need methodology, I think is one thing. If you can get it from people, is okay, that's nice. How did you collect this? Then you can start to look, because sometimes you might look at the methodology and say, no, this is actually not useful. Because my little anecdote with the City of Toronto was working to get some of the stats on the shelter usage, which was published daily. So it was a discussion with researchers, is can we get this automated and open? And by the time it was all, like, we had sort of built a workaround to get it published as using a scraper, because the city was publishing it. It just was publishing it every day, but not as a data set. And by the time I thought we had this big success to make that available, and then all the housing advocates were like, yeah, but this isn't even, like, no, they're like, this data doesn't even tell the story properly. It's not, this isn't right, this isn't right. So, and that's a government source data set. So I think your question about data quality, integrity, methodology, like that stuff is all part of the digital literacy discussion we probably need to be having. So there's one around access to information, there's one around critical thinking before you use the data, because half the time you should probably look at it and be like, I'm not using this, right? Yeah. And so how do you develop that?
So many times you look at it and it's like, I have no idea. You hope you have a friend who, you know what I mean, who took stats in university, who can help you.
I think actually, sorry, you just gave me, the good advice that I can pull out of my story is this. Someone who was close to the topic was the one who could tell me, no, here's why this is a problem. So I think it's always this moment of making sure before you do anything, you find a person, a human being, and several if you can, to give you some context around the data set. That's probably your best insurance as a starting point.
And sometimes you just need to be smart about what you're seeing. For example, I've seen graphs in newspapers, or X and Z graphs, and they don't start from zero. So that's definitely something wrong with that data. They're trying to sell an idea to you from a portion of a bigger data.
Yeah, and it's so much analysis and critical thinking is involved when you look at data. And it's just like a journalist would know. If somebody gives you a store idea, why are you giving me this? Like, what is your end goal? Why are you telling me this? So even when you do get the data, what are you trying to tell me with this information? Like you said, methodology is important as well. And sometimes a lot of what you're getting is absolute junk. Like, I don't know why you're collecting this. This is useless. So in terms of quality, it's, yeah. And there's also a lot of comparison as well. Okay, where's some older stuff that you have that I can kind of try to track and see what you're trying to say here. But no, it's generally not very good. It's, yeah.
Yeah, one thing that I was, just to that point, is that it is frustrating because this information is hard to get and sometimes it is expensive to get. So sometimes the information that's out there is people who are manipulating that information to try to sell you something, because those are the people who are willing to spend the money on getting the data in the first place, and they're not going to just burn that money when they don't get the data that they wish that they had gotten. And then that'll get reprinted because it's a lot easier than going and finding the raw data yourself and then doing the work yourself. So, and that's not a criticism. I mean, like, it sucks trying to get that information. But yeah. The other thing that I was going to say, though, just to your question earlier of like who would have been nice to have here, and I think as this kind of conversation or group or program grows, I'm hoping that we can get more people with a personal stake in these issues here, because yesterday we had a conversation about, what is the story that we're trying to tell, and what we sort of came to as a group is there are people out there. We know that there are people out there who have the stories. They know why the data looks like this. And the fact that we don't know, the fact that the story doesn't make sense to us, isn't because of the data. It's because our perspective is limited, right? So having more people who maybe aren't lawyers or hackers or journalists, but just people with a personal stake in these issues to come and join the conversation, I think would be a really great way of growing our capacity.
I guess following on what you're just saying then, I kind of wanted to bring the discussion, since we're all here together, about what we were talking about earlier, about the translators and people who do, interpreters. And because interpreters are the companies here right now, what do you see as the stories that need to be told, or that or the information you feel like can be derived from the data sets? I know that's been an ongoing conversation, but if we could bring it together here in terms of like a moving forward.
That's good, and that's a good last point, and then I'll wrap it up with a few thoughts. Latha, you want to go?
I don't even know where to begin. There are so many stories to be told. But the fact is that while we do acknowledge diversity, I think we do give, Canada is a bilingual country. We talk about multiculturalism, and yet we put no money towards multilingualism. And all of this money is spent on bilingual services. We're spending over $1 billion translating information into French when we don't need to. Most people don't need the information just in French. However, we have 300 languages in this country, and we're not spending any money making information and services accessible in the languages of the people that live here. I think that's the biggest untold story.
That is a 2018 Canadian theme to think about, really. Yeah, that is, because I can just share one quick thing. I came back from Ottawa recently, and the impact that having to do the two language stuff has on everything is immense. And the companies that are providing that service for that one language translation, like that is big.
So when you're left out.
Repeat yourself before.
I was reading some government document, as I do with my spare time, because I am so cool. And I remember they were talking about how we're a multicultural, bilingual country. I'm like, what is this bunk? Like, continuing to think within that framework is not inclusive at all. It's so exclusionary. And like you said, there's so many people who simply cannot understand what is being said because we continue to only focus on translating things in French. It's so absolutely frustrating. And like you were saying, this focus, even the bilingualism that we supposedly focus on, how many of us who've gone through the Canadian education system can speak one good solid sentence that's not, can I go to the washroom, please, sir? You know what I mean? But we leave so many people out of the equation, just literally leaving people out there in the dark, just as we leave Native communities without clean water, since we're being live streamed. Stories, even that one that I was saying about this feeling of disenfranchisement amongst second and third generation Canadians is an important story to be told, because we're seeing this kind of rumbling, and we're seeing it all over. We're seeing the increase of white supremacy throughout college campuses in all of these neighborhoods. And there's this growing dissatisfaction. We're moving to the point where 50% of the country is going to be non-white. Like, we're seeing this increasing of diversity and this increase of people who are not born here, who are extremely dissatisfied. And we've got this rising right happening, and nobody's actually telling that story. And frankly, a lot of journalists are not qualified to tell that story. They have no understanding. They're still calling people visible minorities when we've moved to minoritize or racialize. So many stories that so many people are not qualified to tell, but that need to be told. And including stories about immigrants and immigrant mental health and immigrant domestic violence and all of these other things, and employment and all of these things that people are facing that there's simply no data for, not the right data, or the data needs to be, you know what I mean, put in a more presentable way.
Kaya, as the youngest member of our crowd here, you got any thoughts, any questions? Talk about, no, nothing? I know that kind of surprised you, so. If you think of something after, you tell us and we'll share it with the group. Anybody else have any, back to Adam's question, in terms of stories to really consider in terms of next steps, specific to translation and interpretation? Anything else? Do you have any follow-up questions you have from those ones?
Yeah, a little, just building on a thought I had earlier, what are your viewpoints in terms of people doing language services as in roles of advocacy versus as just a basic skill, like providing a basic skill to society?
I want to make sure I get that question. Can you talk a little bit more?
Kind of framing it. Do you see them as, do you see people who do work in interpretation as people who have a role of coming together and doing a type of advocacy or lobbying, as opposed to just being a provider of a service?
Yeah. Rather than being unbiased, they are serving as advocacy.
Hang on.
Sorry, no, I'm just, instead of just, not just, because that's incorrect, but instead of servicing, being a non-biased or unbiased interpreter, that they're an interpreter slash advocate, interpreter slash legal advisor.
It's sort of along the same point. I don't know what was said that made us all think along these lines. I was going to say, I think, you know, this sort of hacking event, like hacking data event, is obviously great, but this whole conversation makes me think of just like information hacking, right? So like, I think it would be so cool, and I wouldn't be able to do anything about it, but to bring interpreters together and work on like one piece of legislation and get it translated by professional translators, right? And that wouldn't be in a capacity, like that wouldn't be in a capacity as just, you know, in court. You wouldn't have to be non-biased. It would be a form of advocacy. It would be a form of activism without having to violate any terms of impartiality, and it would provide that really useful information to a whole new group of people, and I think that would be so cool.
And I'm looking at...
So you want to say? No, you go. No, I first, you make a very good point, but I'll first address your question. I think it's dangerous to make interpreters advocates, and it's also not expedient because you want people to be engaged, right? Civic engagement means empowering people to speak within their own voice. So you don't want people to interpret what you may want to say and advocate on your behalf. So that's the reason why we say to interpreters, you are there facilitating as the conduit of information between two parties, and you're not there to put words in people's mouth and say things that they may not have meant to say. Because it can be very disempowering if I'm trying to say something and someone else interprets it and gives it another spin, right? Which is what advocacy does.
But my interpretation of his question wasn't that. It was more like you're dealing with somebody who's a victim of sexual abuse. You're an interpreter who has an understanding of sexual abuse. So I guess it's more sending out. You have a group of interpreters. She deals with family law. You deal with domestic violence. He deals with education. She deals with sports and Toronto Parks and Rec. Exactly. So when you're sending an interpreter, you're sending somebody with the base knowledge. Because like you said, not you, but like somebody said, somebody was saying, I don't know the legal jargon, so I'm just doing a word-for-word translation, whereas the person has an understanding of what's being said. They're not intervening or doing anything different. It's just that they have an understanding of the situation.
We expect them to have the subject matter expertise, but we're not there to step in and clarify.
Exactly. That's really, but I'm not asking for clarification. Just I understand this topic, and so when I'm interpreting, I just having an understanding of a topic helps.
So again, this is where the act of training comes in place. And when we train interpreters to become professional community interpreters, it's really important for them to pursue their education and find a specialization. There are definitely trainings in financial terminologies for them to just go deep into that and go into requests that or about finance. There are trainings that are just advanced medical, training that are advanced legal, and legally you can't really work in that legal sector unless you know those terminologies, and logically you can't work in the medical sector if you don't know the medical terminologies. There's social aspect of things. There's anti oppression, there is human trafficking. All of these are different allies that you can definitely take for your continued competency programs. However, as an agency, we definitely have the role of that filter to make sure that we are sourcing right interpreters through the right assignments. But if interpretation is being sourced, for example, by a police officer to another police officer, or if you ask another community center to send their Farsi-speaking staff, let's say, for a request, then definitely you are missing all of those important sectors.
Okay, so we're pretty much at time, unless anybody has anything really like, ooh, really wish I said it. Anybody got any last thoughts? Looking around? No? Okay. So I have three. Oh, you want to talk about your conferencing?
No, basically we had interpreters and translators in the room, and we posed questions about what they saw their role was and the role of the language industry and so on. So it was very interesting. It was just a discussion. We came up with broad themes, and we're going to take it forward.
And so you guys have data on this.
Yeah.
Maybe you can share in some way.
There's a report that Eliana put together.
It's going to be an open, going to publish it? Hey, that's nice. Good. Okay. So the three sort of big themes I'm hearing here, just to wrap it up and think about what we can do about them. The first one is that there's a lot of missing data, particularly in the context of trying to tell stories about immigrants, newcomers, racialized people. So identifying what's missing in order to get the stories. It's not just that they aren't told, it's that there's fundamental stuff missing in order to tell them. So it's a structural problem. So that's one thing. The second thing is there's a big opportunity to work across sectors on digital literacy, particularly freedom of information stuff, but also policy, how to make requests, those sorts of things. So I think we can talk to the province about maybe adding a session. I'm happy to send that email because they've been asking me stuff about that. So I can send that email on our behalf as a group. And then the final thing is sort of continuing to work together, I think, to identify stories that aren't being told, because you're just not going to find this stuff. And I think unless you get people who aren't together in a room, it will not, stuff won't surface. And I think that's one of the big reasons for Migrahack and the whole, like the concept here is to get different people together that aren't brought together. So I think it's a really good way to end in terms of thanking everybody here who helped convene this discussion. I have so much going through my mind right now, so I'm going to need to write it down and think more what to do. But I'm out in the world, and if you want to, follow up on any data advocacy or anything else, like please let me know, story-wise too. Like there's an open data community that is always looking for stuff to do, and if we don't tell them what to do, they start inventing stuff to do, and it's not useful. So you guys have stuff to, important stuff came up, so let's make sure we write it down and share it as well. That's what I can think of. But I want to really huge thanks to everybody who made this happen, because I think a lot of amazing stuff came out of it, and I hope this isn't the last one. Okay, so thank you. Thank you everybody for all your thoughts, for sharing your stuff. It was great. Thank you.
So does Craig want to say a few words, or I can go?
I can. Do you want me to? Yeah. Do I need a mic for the online? So the first thing I want to say is that Zoya had to leave a little bit earlier, and she didn't want to because this is amazing, and she passed on a heartfelt thanks to all of you for being here for 3 days despite the rain. But no matter how cold and wet it is outside, I feel like it's warm and we're like building all sorts of exciting things inside. And for me, I think that's my big takeaway is we had a quote earlier from, I think it was Cloudy, about how the data is great, the stories are great, but the biggest thing that comes out of these things is a new community gets formed, and then what we can do together. So, and I can see the start of a lot of things that could be, but Bianca and I have seen this with other open data initiatives where it starts without having the right continuous pieces, it can fall. We don't want this to fall. There's too much good stuff that's here. So we have to work on what that would be. And someone had said something about having one receptacle that we could put all the data that's being found in, so it doesn't just exist and disappear. It will maintain accessibility. So I don't know if that's, are there portals out there that we could use, or?
Yes, yeah? Yes, definitely.
Fantastic. And on behalf of Welcome Home TO, we live to bring these sorts of things together, bring people together. So feel free to keep in touch with me. And if there's things that we can do to support your work going forward, that's what we're here for.
Thanks so much. So I just want to make some final thank yous. Thank you so much, Bianca. That was awesome. Thanks for amazing facilitation, for giving us the courage to take this forward, because you were one of the reasons why we had the confidence to take it forward. Craig, for your amazing support throughout all this and giving so many hours of your volunteer time, helping us with social media, tweeting away, all of that. I just wrote down a few thoughts, and I just want to use this opportunity. Thank you for making MCIS's maiden Migrahack a resounding success, all of you. It wouldn't have been possible, so a big clap to all of you. I have to say that when I came in on Friday, I personally went through this whole existential crisis. I was like, oh my God, this my immense inadequacy, I had to face up to it. And I realized the future is here and I haven't caught up with it. However, I made a start, and I was also reassured to see other people in the room feel similarly, selfishly. So this was a very, very courageous effort on our part, I think. So we're all warriors, we took on something huge, and many of you did amazing presentations. I was really just stumped, absolutely, by the quality of stuff that came out in terms of what people were able to achieve in a short period of time. My Eliana, our unsung hero here till just this moment, she is a true warrior, because she actually had the courage to conceive of this. She kept talking to me about open data and Migrahack, and I'm like, I don't even know what the hell you're talking about. And then she gave us all courage to actually step up, to participate, to trust in the process. I think all of us had to, come in and basically be open-minded and trust in the process. So that was amazing. I want to thank all of our amazing facilitators and mentors. So I thanked Bianca, Howard Tam, you came in today on a rainy Sunday. Thank you so much. You also gave us the confidence to go ahead with this. Alex Lowell, who was in our group, he's from MCI, and Neil Cha from U of T, David Doe, Sadia Muzaffar, who gave us an amazing talk that day, very inspiring. Moiz Siddiqui, Zoya's husband who works for Google, Obin Okingwa, I don't know what his affiliation is. Some sort of financial advisor. Right. Dana Wagner, Ramsey Jaber. On Saturday, he gave us an amazing presentation on visualizing impact. I want to thank our partners. Welcome Home Toronto, Fred Victor Center, AXA, Lifeline Syria, Surgeon House. Did I leave anyone out? Pardon? Mozilla, no, I'm going to thank them. And then, of course, our sponsors, Mozilla for the space, Tableau, Mission Software, amazing. And I also want to say, like everybody has already said here, this is not a one-time sort of flash-in-the-pan social experiment of getting people together, feeding them lots of food and showing them some cool software. We actually want to make something of it. So what we want to do is to create a movement. We want to bring the importance of open data, data visualization of social impact to the powers at all levels of government, and we want to share and address all our common concerns. For example, if Canada is now about to welcome 1 million new immigrants over the next 3 years, and that was in the news today, and most of whom will enter through Toronto and probably settle here, we all need to be prepared. We need to create a compassionate society with good living conditions for all of us, and we can't do this if we don't address the gaps in services and infrastructure that exist today, and this can all be made possible only through these kinds of initiatives and conversations that materialize into something concrete, right? So the potential of all that can be achieved is just infinite, I think. So if you would like to stay connected, do let us know. I think Eliana is keeping track of who's in the group. And then we also want you to share your ideas on how you would like to stay involved. And if you have networks that you can connect us with, please let us know. Stay tuned, because we are going to take this forward. We still haven't figured out exactly how, but we want all of you to be part of this. So thanks very much for making it an amazing event.
I need to say just a couple of things. I have to thank volunteers, of course, all of you. Thank you, mentors. But volunteers, Walid, Jasmine, Jana, Laura, Seba, Murian, Nadine, Jagje, for all their time, schedules, and so on. We do have two things in mind. Apparently, we may have a civic tech at MCIS. So because we want to bring some tech people from the downtown, and we've been talking about this for a long time, bring them to Flemington Park. We need some other communities. We need some other techies from other more diverse communities with different maybe interests. That's one thing. And we are definitely committed to have a platform because we have an open access to University of Toronto. So we have a commitment at University of Toronto, we can get students to clean your data sets. So anything you find that you can use, they're gonna clean it for you. Even visualize if they have time, if we make a project. They have internships now. They're definitely looking into, I'm looking into Adam because you're a shining star, and they don't have a chance to talk to you very much, but he is a person who brought a lot of journalists from Ryerson. This man has a WhatsApp group, he knows stuff, he likes it. So you are our connection to Ryerson. You want to connect the iSchool and Ryerson and get all these people, because I understood you don't have a database, education, and you don't understand, not you, but people do not understand importance of primary sources. So that has to be changed. Numbers have to get into our overall education. And other than that, yes, we love this energy. It was amazing. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And let's see. Thank you.